Language and Power Podcast, Episode 6. In this podcast series, we look closely at the language being used in and around COP26. According to the official website, the COP26 summit will bring parties together to accelerate action towards the goals of the Paris Agreement and the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. Language is crucial to understanding the climate crisis, to formulating solutions and negotiating political and economic pitfalls. It's crucial to communicating science findings and recognizing the social, political, and economic conditions which have brought us to crisis point. Language is interaction that can accelerate action. But language is also performance, and performances can be used to distract from inaction, to avoid action, or postpone it. And language is what we focus on in this podcast series. Hello, I am Michael Farrelly. I teach English language at the University of Hull, and I research and write on issues of discourse, politics, policy, and sustainability. And I'm joined, as always, by Tom Bartlett. Hi, Tom.
Hi, Michael. Nice to be here again. And I teach applied linguistics at the University of Glasgow, and particularly just like yourself in critical discourse analysis and language around sustainability. Yep.
We're recording today on the 9th of November, which on the official programme of the COP26 agenda is Gender and Science and Innovation Day. So two separate items on that. Gender is progressing gender equality and the full and meaningful participation of women and girls in climate action, according to the programme. And science innovation is demonstrating that science and innovation can deliver climate solutions to meet and accelerate increased ambition. So interesting that they've got but those two on the same day rather than on separate days. Today is also sees the release of the first draft of the COP Glasgow text. And Greenpeace have already commented that they see it as being an exceptionally weak document with, and quote, no mention of fossil fuel phase out. So I think we'll look at those documents, the text of that and the Greenpeace response perhaps later in the week, Tom.
That'd be a really nice change of shift towards the official documents, which we haven't had much chance to look at yet. They've been behind closed doors of all this stuff.
Exactly, yeah. So it should be interesting. So look out for that later in the week. Today's topic, we're going to be looking at the reporting of COP demonstrations. So there were a lot of demonstrations over the weekend, as we spoke about yesterday in yesterday's podcast. We're going to look at news reports from an American online web service, Democracy Now!, and another report from UK's Daily Mail newspaper. So let's start with the Democracy Now! Report. The title is "We Are Not Responsible," quote, "Youth climate activists rally in Glasgow to demand world leaders act now," published on the 8th of November. And the thing about this is that it's a video. And what we've also got the transcript. We'll put the link to the video in the show description. So the transcript starts with the presenter, Amy Goodman. The United Nations Climate Summit has entered its second week. On Friday and Saturday, over 100,000 demonstrators took part in a pair of major climate rallies in the streets of Glasgow, Scotland. The first protest was organised by Fridays for Future, an international movement of students which grew out of Greta Thunberg's climate strike outside the Swedish Parliament in 2018. We begin today's show with some highlights from Friday's rally. This is Ugandan climate justice activist Evelyn Hatcham. And Evelyn Hatcham is then shown to say, "We emit very little CO2 emission, but we are suffering from some of the worst impacts. People are dying from floods, disasters like droughts are drying up people's crops, people's food. Uganda heavily depends on agriculture for food and water. But again, agriculture depends on the natural systems. That means people are left hungry without nothing to eat or drink." And then there are several speakers shown on this video. I'm going to skip forward and read a little bit from a speaker called Michaela Loach, who is from the UK. And I want to read this because we're going to mention some of what she speaks of in our analysis. She says, "My heart was broken by the people inside that COP building, by the world leaders who steal our sacred words and use them to defend and uphold the oppressive systems of capitalism and white supremacy, who tell us that action needed to prevent sea level rise engulfing my ancestral home in Jamaica is impossible or not practical. In this heartbreak, fear, and despair, I felt weak, but I will allow myself the space for my heart to break so that the gold of community can be poured into those cracks and make it stronger, make it bigger, because every time my heart breaks, it is made stronger. She goes on, and I'll just read the second part. The antidote to despair is not to turn and run away or ignore the realities of the societal violence around us. It is not to ignore the violence of our siblings on the front lines who experience at the hands of the neo-colonial fossil fuel companies. It is not to ignore the hypocrisy of the UK government, the host of this conference, who prop up these violent fossil fuel companies with £4 billion of our public money in subsidies. This same government who are trying to approve the Cambo oil field and 39 other oil and gas projects at a time when the IEA and the IPCC have said that we can have no new investment in oil and gas if we want a livable future. This is worse than hypocrisy, she says. It is violence. In the face of this violence and despair, we cannot give up, cannot be overwhelmed. We must act. These are last resort times. So do whatever you can and be audacious about how incredible the future we can create can be. We have to believe that we can achieve it. So, Tom, first thoughts on that text.
Okay, I mean, yeah, very interesting stuff. And I think it's worth saying a bit about Democracy Now, which is a very left-wing broadcast corporation. I think I first became aware of them when I worked in the States and was driving through Virginia. And the hour-long program used to come on in the morning. It was very, very interesting, first of all, because it was such a different viewpoint from mainstream US press. It's a subscription-funded service. Uh, Very radical, probably Marxist in orientation, would be fair to say. And as I was driving on my way to work, passing the National Rifle Association, quite ironically, the absolute epitome of the opposite side of the States listening to this. But it's also a station that takes its time, and I think we've seen some evidence of that. They can have 15-minute interviews on the news programs. It's not a sound bites programs. It is a program that likes to dig into things and see alternative sides. But my first thoughts on that, Michael, on reading this was, first of all, it focuses a lot more on the immediate suffering of people at the moment. Where we've seen a bit of that, particularly with Chinese, Syria, and that. But a lot of stuff we've looked at is focused on environmental degradation at the moment. Hasn't necessarily focused actually on the physical suffering of the humans behind that who are carrying out day-to-day jobs and starving and the like. But that's sort of been erased a little bit. We've been focusing on pollution. In a way, the main emphasis I get the main emphasis has been on the future and to avoid really bad pollution and environmental degradation in the future, and really sort of ignoring those places where this is actually the present reality. So it's come from very much, even Greta Thunberg, when she talks about you've stolen my future, but we're actually hearing people whose present has been stolen here, which is quite different. So it's also got those different voices, but also throughout the article, it's actually, I think, as we talked about earlier, it's actually talking about global capitalism as being cause, which is not at all unexpected from this out, but it's something that again is hinted at in other outlets. So you talked earlier on about Boris Johnson with this half-time and 5-1 metaphor, having a climate disaster as something to fight as if it was separate, humanity fighting against it, which is one form of erasure, or moving out human responsibility for climate crisis. But there's another level we're saying here is, well, what's behind the human effort? It's the human activity that creates climate crisis. It's not just we are pumping too much pollution into the atmosphere and we're sort of ignoring that, but we're actually ignoring that the main cause of that is production, the capitalist system, or according to Democracy Now, we have to look even deep and say you can't just, it's the forces of global capitalism that are making people degrade the environment. So quite a much more radical message than we've heard anywhere else.
That's really interesting. Indeed, what we haven't really heard from it or seen in the text that we've looked at least in this series, is that context for the physical burning, the physical chemical reactions that cause, directly cause the emission of greenhouse gases. We haven't talked about the social context that enables that to happen. And so here we've got it front and center in the quotes from speakers in this article. And well, it's a video, isn't it? So it's a 15-minute video, as you say, a long form and a lot of space given to the speakers at that Glasgow rally, which is something that you don't see in mainstream TV news. Um, and so it's an interesting departure. And it departs in a number of ways. The people who are protesters are named. And again, in TV news, you'd often see that, protesters are there. And if there's a famous protester, such as Greta Thunberg, such as a celebrity, they would be named. But these are people who are not celebrities as celebrities, but they do give them their name. The announcer names them. We've got this extended quotation. So this long, long quotation, so you said, of showing the people on the stage speaking to the rally. And again, in mainstream TV news, that's not something you might get a sound bite, but not these long sections of speech, especially for people who are not in themselves to the audience. And then because you have this long quotation, this long giving of voice to the people who are speaking at the stage, we don't have the reporter inserting themselves and commenting and framing the how we're supposed to understand and interpret what the people are saying on stage, which is again is something quite different from a mainstream TV news, who might give you a little soundbite, might give you a bit of a clip of somebody speaking, but they would tell you something about it, tell you something about the people, tell you something about what it means in the content, and give you a kind of steer on how you should understand it. So really, really quite different. So I wanted to talk about some of the metaphor that we see, particularly in that section from Michaela Loach. I think really, really fascinating metaphors there. So the first one, my heart was broken by the people inside that COP building, by the world leaders who steal our sacred words and use them to defend and uphold the oppressive system of capitalism and white supremacy. So what we've got here is a metaphor of words as objects. Not only are they objects, but they are precious. They are valuable when they are, they're sacred. They're the kind of things that can be stolen. But on top of that, and this is really interesting, is that the metaphor also sees them as having a kind of conflict capability in the form of shields. They can be used to defend the current system and used against the people who uttered them in the first place. So that's a really interesting way of thinking about it and thinking about what language is doing. I think what we've got here, the metaphor does have this conflict. There are people on two sides of the conflict: the attackers, in this metaphor, the people who are protesting and who are climate activists, and the defenders in this case are the capitalists and the white supremacists, which is a really interesting inversion of how we often think about those two sets of people. But what we have here, even similar to metaphors we've seen earlier in this series, we have this conflict between separation of people with a conflict, a fight. But what's happening in this case is it's describing the relationship between sets of people. In previous metaphors, the football metaphor we saw from Johnson in the first episode, that was a metaphor which showed a separation between people and climate change. Here we've got a separation between people and people, different groups of people with different interests when it comes to climate change. So I think that's really, really interesting too.
Yeah, Dan, it's interesting, isn't it, that again, we find so much of the language of COP. People have been talking about language itself and the role of
Yeah.
language. I mean, probably the sound bite of the whole COP will be blah, blah, blah. And that will be, word of the year in the dictionary, if you can count as a word. But here again, as you pointed out, we've got Michaela talking about language as being sacred. And of course, the opposite of that was when we saw Chase saying that the language of the leaders was pollution. That there's this fake promises in language that language can be pollution, language can be golden, language can solve. So much reflection on the power of language during the COP process, which of course is perfect for us. But people are aware of how important language is to hide or to move things forward.
Yeah, yeah. I wanted to pick out one more metaphor because I thought this was lovely. same speaker, Michaela Loach says, "But I will allow myself the space for my heart to break so that the
Yeah.
gold of community can be poured into those cracks and make it stronger, make it bigger, because every time my heart breaks, it is made stronger." And I think that's lovely. It is about people again. It is about relationships, but in this case, it's about, that wider sense of community and solidarity that she's trying to tap into.
Yeah, but by becoming broken and open, things
Mm,
can renew in a wider, broad way. It's it's the cracks where the light gets in. We expand by finding problems, getting past them. So there's this past experience used, to
mm,
in a negative experience can be used in a positive way. It's a great metaphor, isn't it?
mm. And what we'll see, I mean, just as to look forward to future episodes, we will be thinking about how people are, how people deal with a kind of sense of fear, frustration, anxiety as well. And this is
Yeah,
a really interesting way of looking at it. Let's have a look at the second text for today, the Daily Mail article.
yeah. I was
Bill.
just so well, really interesting because when we were choosing articles to look at today, we said, well, let's find coverage from two very different ideologically positioned sources to see how they cover the march. And Democracy Now! Has covered it in very much the way we would have expected it to, but very different from other stuff we've seen so far. But it was not a surprise at all. Whereas actually the Daily Mail surprised both Michael and myself
Mm,
from looking at the coverage there. Well, again, we'll put up the URL so that you can follow the coverage. But what Michael and I both thought was how ambivalent it is. It's not really negative in the way we expected the representations to be, both in terms of the protesters and Greta Thunberg in particular. So it starts off more than 50,000 eco warriors are demonstrated in cities. Eco warriors probably carries what we'd call a negative prosody in terms of it's not negative in itself, but if you look up all the times that's been used in the past, it carries negative associations with it.
mm.
So that's a bit like
Especially
that.
in publications like the Daily Mail.
Yes, exactly. You've got to
Yeah.
look and see
Mm,
where it's been
mm,
used in the
mm,
past, not just the general. Yeah, exactly. Yep. And then it goes on thousands of people, including students and left-wing activists. Now, again, students should be a neutral categorization, but students and left-wing activists to people who look at search the Daily Mail and readers the Daily Mail. We know those are scare phrases, but however, it really carries on. Yes, so they're reading capitalism is killing the planet. So we know that the students left and activists seem to be extremists, a bit daft, who work the loony left, as the right wing press used to call us. But then it was a kind of atmosphere along the way, despite the rain and cold winds. People kept close watch of a group of young men in black anarchist flags, etc. But then after that, we get this carnival feel of old ladies and young women saying this has been a wonderful, peaceful, not violent event. How wonderful it's all been. Greta Thunberg has been quoted in very favourable terms. She's no longer being presented as this spoiled brat or this girl who should be back at school. She's been presented as a serious voice. So we see that things have changed quite a lot. There's very positive coverage of the actual message, lots and lots of pictures, which are generally very positive. But if you look at those pictures, and it's really worth going and having a look at the whole raft of pictures the Daily Mail's got there, it's almost like a carnival feel. It's a happy, joyous thing, which is so different from the message of Democracy Now! Emphasizing the violence of global capitalism on society. So, in a way, we've got the Daily Mail seems what we're talking about creating more and more noise in favor of protest or against global degradations and stuff. It seems that the Daily Mail's had to change its message slightly. Both Michael and I were expecting a far more critical stance towards the protesters, but the Daily Mail's had to shift a little. But it's
mm,
interesting, it distanced itself very much from the lefties and the students at the beginning and the black clad anarchists. And it ends up with a comparison with the Insulate Britain protests, again suggesting that these guys are crazy. So it seems to have shifted. And this is, if we take it into political theory and discourse thing, we've mentioned Gramsci before, those in power have to change a little bit. They have to increase their constituency to stay in power. and go with the times. And so the Daily Mail's had to open up. It's a bit, the move against global climate change has become such that the Daily Mail and other publications have had to open up and take some of that on board because their own readers are now become more worried about it. And their own readers aren't as hardline as they were before. So we can now have the laughing grannies, the pleasant policemen, Greta Thunberg's okay. They're now being allied with the sensitive Daily Mail reader, and the opposition is now not the whole movement, but the black-clad anarchists, the students and lefties,
Mm,
and the Insulate Britain crowd. So it's still old message, but it's had to shift. And
yeah,
actually, these are the cracks where the light gets in, because
yeah.
there's a crack now. They've had to
Mm,
expand their discourse, change the number of things they talk about to get a wider constituency. Change happens slowly with some organs, and this is a definite sign of change. It might be perceptible over time, but if you look at the coverage of climate protest in the Daily Mail over the last 10 years, you'll see a notable shift. So
mm.
change does happen slowly, as it has to change its message to stay relevant.
Yeah, you were talking about, in those discourse analytic terms and go to Gramscian terms of hegemonic lines being redrawn,
Yes.
and it looks like an example of that. And you can see it. I mean, as you say in the text, where you've got at the beginning the lefties, the eco warriors, the students, and then you look the people who are actually quoted and named.
Yeah.
Yeah. A lady from Abergavenny in Wales, Cynthia Benjamin, 48, from Abergavenny in Wales, and she's then quoted, and we find out that she's also a sales manager, so not a student. We don't know whether she's a left wing activist. That's kind of left out here, but certainly she's
She's holding down a responsible job.
responsible job, and so a great approval there from the Daily Mail. And then we've got Erica Bloom, 71, from Bristol, again quoted, and sort of a retirement age lady, being quoted and named. So they're being given a kind of prominence as individuals that some of the students and the um, apparent left wing activists are not, and you
And
can
it's
so
just,
that clearly seeing the ambivalence in the
yeah.
reporting there. Yeah,
And both those people mentioned the sort of types who might well be within the Daily Mail demographic. Of course, it's not so
yeah,
straightforward, but retirement age females, Daily Mail
mm,
is definitely skewed towards the older age group, and also has the largest female readership of all the British popular press.
mm,
So they're presenting types who the reader can affiliate with, can associate with, and is happy to be on message with.
mm,
So, which is rather that so that they are in them, connecting with the protesters rather than being separated from them.
yeah, yeah. Let's move on because this does connect to the soundbite of the day.
Yes, we
Uh,
should get a little jingle for the soundbite of the day.
I'll see what I can do. Uh, but so this is a tweet, Thelma Young Latuna Tabua. And she says, it seems like one of the fundamental climate divides in the world is one, people who want to figure out how to keep the world as is, but still meet whatever targets. And two, people who recognize that we need to fundamentally change the order of things in order to survive. And I think that's a really nice soundbite given what we've just been looking at.
Captures it all, doesn't it?
Yeah. On the one hand, I guess, democracy now would be on the side of number two, saying that in order to solve this problem, we need fundamental change. Capitalism, white supremacy, all of the things that were mentioned by the speakers are the things that we need
Yep.
to, at root cause, tackle. Whereas, how do we understand this, as we've spoken about, redrawing of the lines in the Daily Mail, where they're kind of coming on board with this? Well, I think, they've been category one. They want to keep things as close to being as they are, yet trying to accommodate, address some of the clear threats posed by climate change.
Yep.
And I think that's how we can probably see and understand the differences that we're seeing with these two very different news organizations, reporting the protests positively, but as we've said earlier, from a very different point of view and with very, very different motives.
No, it's great, Nick. 'Cause I think the quote captures that we're seeing in terms of the actual action, so the people who want the system to change the same, and they will accommodate a bit because they don't want the end of the world in their
Mm,
lifetime. And then the Daily Mail changing its message of it does want to lead on its readership. So one's accommodating in terms of discourse and words, and others accommodating in terms of action, but they're not really changing very much. Whereas the people, the Democracy Now crowd, and a lot of the people we've also heard from other places want to change the global economic system. But I suppose in this way, Democracy Now is a bit more entrenched in terms of it's not changing its message.
mm,
It's sticking there. It's not looking for new constituents. And so going back to what we were talking about, voice and having a multitude of voices, they're just sticking where they are. They're not worried about getting a wider readership list. So they are staying very ideologically on message. But it does make us think about our own activism. Who are the people should we deal with? I walked into university this morning. There was a poster saying COP welcomes climate criminals. I'm thinking, well, yeah, they've got to, because these are the people who've got to change. If we only had all the people against climate change here, it would just be virtue signaling.
mm.
So yes, of course that, but it depends what you mean by welcome. Does it mean putting up with and trying to get them to change, or does it mean celebrating them and making things? So we've got to be strategic, and it does mean sometimes getting a message across in media and organs you wouldn't necessarily affiliate with. But actually, it's much more important to change them in some small way than it is to carry on in the same echo chamber.
Mm, mm. Yeah, yeah. Really interesting. We'll continue, no doubt, later in the week. We've got some nice texts to look at lined up already, and we've got a couple of guests to look forward to speaking with tomorrow and Thursday. Tomorrow we'll be speaking with Johnny Unger from Lancaster University on
Looking
social
forward to that
media.
very much.
Yeah, me
Those of
too.
you fed up with our two voices, we'll have a variety.
Yes, indeed. Okay. Thanks very much for listening, and see you again.
Bye now.